Well, good evening. Welcome to Cafe Scientifique. I'm Roger Whiting. I'm from Roxrow. We founded and are now co-sponsors with our host this evening, SRI of Cafe Sci. And one question we always ask is, how many times is this your first Cafe Scientifique? It always amazes us that there are so many, which is always pleasing. Yeah, okay, my fault. So, the between the talk and the question and answer session, there'll be a drawing for the Kepler's £30 book prize, which we'll give out. $30. Oh, my British background coming out. I think it's round about 1.54, the exchange rate at the moment. So today we're very pleased to have Steve Lindley here, who's from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to talk about the collapse of California salmon. And I think everyone's aware that for a couple of years, salmon fishing, because of the collapse that had occurred, was actually stopped in California. So it's a really intriguing topic, and it's something that I know Stephen's been very much involved with. And as you came in, you probably got something about the collapse of the Salmon salmon, and he was telling me that he's been involved with that group as well. So, Steve, I'll leave it over to you. I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting topic. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I heard about the cafe a few years ago, I think, when it first started up, and I thought it was just a fantastic idea, and I'm glad to see that it's really catching on and building. I often get to speak to other scientists and natural resource managers, and that's an important part of my job, but I don't so often get to speak to the general public. And we hear from our scientists from our various scientific societies how important it is to engage with the public. It builds support for science, and that's an important thing. But in the case of natural resource sciences, I think there's even a better opportunity there, because a lot of the problems that I'm going to be talking about today are ultimately social problems, and in a democracy, your vote can influence how things turn out. And if you take home anything from what I tell you today, what you read in the newspaper, when you read quotes by any interest group, be they fishermen, water users, or whatever, they're probably oversimplifying things, and you're going to need to think a little bit harder about the issue. And hopefully, at the end of this talk, you'll have a good idea of what's going on with salmon in California and what we might need to do to fix things. So there really are two crises with California salmon. The first one that I'll talk about, and I'll spend the most of the time talking about, is what's happened with the fall run Chinook salmon in California, which until quite recently seemed to be a very robust stock. If you got wild salmon in the market, troll-caught California salmon, or even in Oregon, the great likelihood was that those fish came from the Sacramento River here in California, and they were really the backbone of the Chinook salmon fishery along the west coast. And you'd have to go to Alaska really to find bigger fisheries there, and those are quite enormous. But for decades now, there's been another crisis, really for the better part of a century or more since the gold rush, and that has to do with other runs of Chinook salmon, and there are actually 4 in the Central Valley. And I'll try the pointer here, if everyone can see the little hand there. So this graph shows, the bars show some estimates of the peak abundance of the number of fish returning to the river each year, is how salmon biologists typically measure this. And the error bars there show the average and range of abundance returning to the rivers over the past few decades. And we see that fall Chinook still have been reaching near historic levels of abundance up until quite recently. They seem to be doing okay, but these other runs of Chinook salmon, the spring run, the winter run, and the late fall, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means for the fish and for fisheries, are at tiny fractions of their historic abundances. And in fact, these are listed under the Endangered Species Act. The winter Chinook is an endangered species. The spring run Chinook is a threatened species, and that may be under reconsideration at the moment, that they may actually be endangered as well. The late fall is legally part of the fall run. It's biologically distinct, but not quite distinct enough to have warranted a listing status of its own. But the point is, these have been decimated for a long time. The cause of that is mostly due to the large water storage dams that California depends on. And most of the work I do has to do with the conservation of these very rare and threatened fish. But I do work a bit on the fall run, and my colleagues in Santa Cruz work extensively on this. So I'll come back to some of the commonalities, or I hope to synthesize a bit what's happened to those runs that are now rare and what's happening to the fall run right now. So the crisis really began in 2007 when the ocean fishing was much poorer than expected. And some guys at my work actually were out fishing, and they didn't catch very many. It was the beginning of the season, but the fish they caught were really big. And at first, people thought, well, that's kind of, they're fun to catch when they're big and there's a lot of meat on them. But when you think about it then, that's an alarming sign. And that's when we started getting worried, really, that opening weekend, because the small fish that usually are very abundant are the young ones. And when there are no young fish in a population, it means that the recruitment, the new fish coming into the population aren't there as they would have been expected. So that was the alarm sign. It was a dismal fishery. Very few fish came back to the river. And then that led to the closures in 2008 and 2009. And those were record low returns to the river. And then in 2010, we've had a season mostly for recreational fishing, and a very limited commercial fishery. I think it was open for 4 days or so, and not many fish were landed. I couldn't find it in the market this year. Another interesting thing to note from this graphic is that fall run Chinook salmon for some decades just kind of bounced around within an acceptable range. The fishery is actually managed so that between about 100 and 200,000 fish return to the river each year. This is thought to be enough to ensure maximum sustainable yield, a concept that's used to manage fisheries. And in about 1990, conservation measures kicked in to protect these threatened and endangered stocks that I was talking about. So they have a lot of problems. Fisheries is probably a small part of the problem, but they are protected, and fisheries were curtailed to protect the fish. And not terribly surprising to us, the abundance of fall Chinook began climbing. And it climbed and climbed and climbed until 2002 when record returns came back to the Central Valley. It was amazing. There's one small creek, Battle Creek, in the northern Sacramento River Valley. It's something you can wade across in the summer, and about 500,000 fish returned to that one creek that year. And at the time, people were wanting to declare victory, that we had this great success story, but we should have viewed that really as an alarm sign even then, that we have a system now that seems to be prone to booms and busts that didn't used to do that. And I'll talk about that a fair bit. So that plot I was showing was the number of fish coming back to the river. Another way of looking at it that has a lot more information is to look at how many fish there are in the population, which would be the fish that come back to the river, as well as the ones that are caught in ocean fisheries and caught in the river, where there's a sport fishery. And that's what this plot shows. The dark bars along the bottom are the returns to the river. The light gray bars are the fish that are caught in the ocean, and the little white bars there are the recreational river fishery. So that's a small part of it, but we can keep track of that. And the thing to note from this graph, that while 2002 was the record return to the river, it wasn't the highest abundance that we've ever seen for fall Chinook in the Central Valley. In fact, in the mid-'80s, we saw even higher levels of abundance. And as the returns have held fairly steady or gone up and down in a range over time, the catch has been declining year after year. And this has something to do with changes in fisheries management. As I said, there's some protections for these rare stocks in the Central Valley. Also, the Klamath River, you may have heard there was a fishery disaster there just a few years before the one in the Central Valley, and that can curtail fisheries away from the Klamath, and it has impacts on the Sacramento River. So this is painting a kind of a warning sign as well here, that the catch is going down, but the returns aren't really responding by going up too much. So what's going on in 2010? And I thought I'd throw this in there just to tell you how it is that we set fishing seasons in advance of knowing really what's going on. So the main piece of information we have to know what to expect in a coming fishing season has to do with the number of returning very young fish, 2-year-old fish, which are called jacks, in the year before. And it's a very simple model that's used to forecast the returns. It's basically just a simple regression model. And in 08 and 09 down here, the forecast was quite low, and it shows here that the returns were not far off the model, although in 09 there were even fewer coming back than had been predicted, and it was predicted to be so bad that no fishing was allowed. In 2010, the forecast was expected to be high enough to allow fishing, and in fact we did have a fishery, but you notice here this envelope of dashed lines is the uncertainty in this forecast model, and it's very, very large. So as scientists, we wouldn't be terribly surprised to see this year if we'd had a pretty respectable return or almost no fish coming back. That's within the predictive ability of this model that we have. We're working on trying to improve that, but it's just a really hard thing to do, and the scientists who work in the offices right on either side of me who make this forecast, they sweat bullets over this because they turn off a fishery, and fishermen have a very tough life, but if they let it go and it turns out that the salmon don't come back, then there's big problems too for the fishing the following years. It's part of the business. So the collapse that became evident in 2007 and closed the fishery in 2008 led the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which is the body, it's an advisory body to the government that really proposes and usually sets the fishing rules, asked the National Marine Fisheries Service to lead a group of scientists in an investigation of what happened that led to this collapse in 2007 in particular, but also 2008. And we were given a list of 42 potential causes for this. It was pretty daunting to get the letter, and I was one of about 24 people who worked together on a report about this problem. And you can group the suspects in this kind of a murder mystery into a bunch of different classes of problems. And many people immediately zeroed in here on the right. It has something to do with California's use of water. There's enormous pumps in the south delta of the Sacramento River, which is on the upper right there. The water flows in from the rivers into the delta, and these pumps fill the canal, which then pumps water down the San Joaquin Valley and as far as Southern California. And of course, Northern Californians don't like that. It's Northern California water, and they don't want it to go to LA. It's a perennial political hot potato. And it is true that some fish go into those pumps and die there. There's also another very troubling facility on the upper Sacramento River, the Red Bluff Diversion Dam. It fills a canal that's a Hamacalusa Canal for irrigation in the Northern Valley. And this is, I think, a pretty well-known fish killer, but the operations have been changed over time. It's not nearly so bad, and it's actually slated for removal. There was also a bridge being constructed over Carquinez Straits. You may have experienced that or seen that driving up to Sacramento. And that involved a lot of pile driving of huge steel beams down into the sediment, and there's incredible sound levels that come from that can actually kill fish that are in the area. So there were these kinds of activities in the freshwater environment. Then there was the Costco-Busan oil spill that happened at about this time. There has been other sources of pollution. There are a number of new pesticides that have been developed and are being applied in Central Valley agriculture at increasing rates. Some of these are now understood to be pretty problematic to salmon. Another thing that goes on in the rivers are fish hatcheries. As I'll talk about, a lot of these fish actually are born in hatcheries and released into the bay, and that's really what's been supporting the fishery in recent decades. And this was the time of the pet food scare. If you remember the Chinese melamine contamination in animal feeds, that was actually in the fish food supply. So just at this time, hatcheries are very effective at producing fish, but because they have so many fish crammed together, they often have disease outbreaks. And this salmon here is suffering from bacterial kidney disease. Some of the other things that we know in the past have caused big troubles for salmon populations are floods. When the juvenile salmon are in the gravel, if you get very high flows, the gravel can move around, it disrupts their nests, and it can kill the juveniles in the gravel. The other thing that's bad for salmon are droughts. And we've actually had both of these conditions in recent years. Another kind of source of problems were things in the ocean. Whenever you have a fishery collapse, the traditional place to look for that is actually fisheries themselves. So that's a picture of a salmon trawler there. We looked at that pretty carefully. Ocean conditions, as I'll explain about the salmon life cycle, you probably all know they live in the river and they live in the ocean too. They do much of their living and growing in the ocean, and they are sensitive to environmental variation there, and I'll talk about that a fair bit. And another thing were red tides. These are increasing in frequency and intensity in California coastal waters. And also in the ocean, salmon are eaten by many kinds of creatures. There's a picture of a sea lion munching down on one right here. Sea lions are increasing in abundance. They're protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and their populations have been doing better and better. They have some ups and downs too, but generally there's a lot more than there used to be, and they eat salmon. There are a number of birds that eat fish, eat juvenile salmon, other kinds of fish like lingcod. They've been rebuilding, or lingcod populations, they eat salmon sometimes. Striped bass, it's an interesting story. There's actually some lawsuits going on about this. There are non-native species. They were introduced in the late 1800s, and they definitely eat salmon, but they've been going down in abundance over the decades. And then finally, one of the most fun things to think about is this giant squid, the Humboldt squid, that has invaded up out of the Gulf of California and reaches far north as Alaska. And they haven't been seen doing this in probably 50 years. And there are many, many, many of these things out off the coast, or until quite recently. They seem to have disappeared. But just about this time is when these things were exploding. And there are these huge 5 or foot long squids that have been reported to actually drowned people in Mexico on rare occasion. They're pretty nasty predators. And they're thought to be eating more hake, which is one of California's largest fisheries, than the fishery actually captures. So we looked at all of these things in great depth. And now I'm going to get into a little bit of a technical point here. And if this doesn't make sense to you, please raise your hand, because it's really critical to understand what we did. And this is the salmon life cycle and its timing. And there's a little bit of jargon that you have to understand about this. Salmon occur in cohorts, and you can think of a cohort like as your classmates in school. You're all about the same age. You progress through life together, your different life stages. And we call salmon cohorts, in fact, and we keep track of them by their brood year. And the brood year is the time when they are eggs in the gravel, and for fall run Chinook salmon, that happens in the autumn. So the brood year 2004 fish, the eggs were laid in the fall of 2004. Then, that's here, they rear for a few months in the river, and they typically move out into the ocean in the following spring. So in 2005, they would have been moving down the river, through the estuary, and into the coastal ocean. And they typically spend then a couple summers in the ocean, and then they come back at age 3. So the 2004 brood year gives rise to the fish that are in the fishery and coming back to the river in 2007. So that's brood year 2004 is what we're looking at in our investigation, and also brood year 2005 for the 2008 fish. It's a little more complicated than that, unfortunately. For coho salmon, this would be exactly correct, but Chinook have some variability. They can return at older ages as well. Did everybody get that? So the brood year thing? Okay, because I get lost on this. I have to look at this picture when I work on this stuff because it's so confusing. So this is a schematic of how we structured our analysis and thinking about it, and it's another sketch of the salmon life cycle. And as I alluded to, it occurs in 2 places. There's in nature, and that's this line here from the parents to the eggs, the fry, the smolts, which is the stage that goes from the river to the ocean. And then they recruit to the fishery at age 2. That's when we first start seeing them being caught offshore. And then they typically come back at age 3. There's a parallel path that a lot of them go through, which is in captivity in fish hatcheries. And they do that up till about the time of the smolts. And on the outside of this diagram here, I've listed the kinds of things that can kill salmon. And further, the kinds of things that people do that influence that. So there's any number of things, even more than 42, that can kill the salmon. And what we were trying to do is find out where in the salmon's life cycle do we see a big drop in their abundance compared to what we expect. So, when did they get killed? And then we wanted to look at all of the factors that could have caused that and try to find the ones that were at unusual levels. So when the fish were migrating through the river, was there a chemical spill at that time? Or were the pumps operating and catching a lot of them? And we'd hoped, and there was no guarantee that I would have expected even probably that we wouldn't find a smoking gun. But the smoking gun would be the intersection between this life cycle that suddenly crashes and something weird going on in the environment. So that's really what we did for 2 of these broods. And along the right here, oops, there is again the timeline. So this happens over several years, from the fall of the brood year to the brood year 3 years later, when the fish are really entering the fishery and starting to come back to the rivers. So is there any questions about this? And also, if I start spewing salmon biology jargon too much, please do interrupt on that. I don't want to lose you with that, but it's always a danger. Yes?
In captivity, when it reaches the smolts, they go into the ocean there?
Yes. Yes.
They're released into the ocean.
They are. This is a very important point, too. Thank you for raising that. I did skip over that. So part of the point of this diagram is that the fish in captivity experience a totally distinct set of potential problems than the ones in the wild, up to the point that they're smolts. And they are, in fact, in a captive environment in the hatchery, and then they're put into trucks and driven down I-5 to the delta or into the bay, where they're put in, if they're lucky, into some floating barges directly in the bay, where they can acclimate a little bit, and then they're released into the bay. So they can avoid the river, all the problems with the river habitat, these pumps that are people love to blame for these problems, and everything else on the right here that the wild fish have to deal with. These guys get a pass, but they have their own problems. And at the point of the smolts in the bay is when the population merges.
So what percentage of the smolts from captivity and what percentage from the
This has been a subject of debate for a long time. We're just now getting information on that, and it might be 90% now in captivity. 30 years ago, it would have been 5%. So I'll get to this later. This is one of the problems with our system. So this is some of the most important data that I'm going to present about explaining what's going on. And these are different points in the life cycle where we can measure the salmon, their abundance. We can count their parents. We know how many fish are released from the hatcheries, because there are very good records on that. We can catch them at Chips Island in a trawl that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been doing for decades. It's a very good survey. And this is the point where they're just entering the estuary. It's near Carquinez Strait. And that's where it starts to get salty. And I normalize these things to their averages over different periods of time, usually a couple decades that I have data. So this is the one line here. So if it's right on the one line, it means the conditions, that these numbers were exactly average from what we've seen. So we see that these measures of abundance, the parents that gave rise to this brood, were at very typical levels. The hatchery releases were at typical levels. The catch at Chips Island, so the number of fish entering the estuary, very typical. The next time we get to see them, really, is some of these fish carry little wire tags and are released in the bay, and then they're caught in the fishery at age 2, and they come back to the river. And you can form an estimate of survival by looking at how many of those tags were released and then how many were recovered in the fishery. And we see that for these broods, 2004 and 2005, this survival rate index was a tiny fraction, maybe 5% of what's typical. So we conclude from that something happened between them entering the estuary and them appearing in the ocean fishery a couple years later. And we see that this trend holds up with the 2-year-olds that actually were returning to the river, although they come back a little bit better than that. And then the adults as well the following year are at a quarter of the level that you would have expected. So we conclude from that, yes?
So the 0 line is the average for each of the bars independently?
The 1 line, yes. I'm sorry, yeah, it's a 1, it's obscured a bit. Yeah, the 1 line, that's right. So they're all normalized against themselves, their own records.
Suggestion, could you repeat questions? Because I can't hear anything they say.
Okay, thank you, yes. So he asked about the 1 line and whether that's the average relative to each data series, and that's the answer is yes. Okay, another hint, I hope this shows up, that something was probably going on in the ocean rather than just the estuary was that the salmon declines were more widespread than just the Sacramento Valley. We see that coho salmon from Washington, Puget Sound, Washington, the Oregon coast, and off to California also show the same pattern of declining after about 2002 to very low levels. And the only thing that coho salmon in Oregon have in common with Chinook salmon in California's Central Valley is that they share the same ocean environment. So it looks like something was going on in the ocean. In spite of that, we did look exhaustively through all possible data sets about what's going on in freshwater and in the estuary. And rather than bore you to tears with that, I will just summarize with this little table what was going on. So river flow, people found statistically that's often correlated with salmon survival and their abundance. And in 2005, the flows were normal. 2006, they were high, and that's usually good for salmon, unless they're really high during a bad time. But 2006, if you remember, was a very wet spring. Water temperatures were very near normal conditions that are associated with normal salmon returns. The number of hatchery fish, as I showed, were normal. They looked to be of normal size and condition. There were no unusual outbreaks of disease in the hatcheries. The delta exports, these pumps, were high in 2005 and near normal in 2006. We don't think that the exports are really the explanation, though, because this high rate of pumping from the delta occurs after the salmon have left the system. And it's not an accident. They're actually regulated to protect the salmon. So while the exports were high, it wasn't at the right time to really explain what's going on. And other years with exports about that high, nothing really bad happened to Sacramento River Fall Chinook. The outflow was high and very high out of the delta in these years because they were wet years. That's good for salmon. There's the water diversions, which are related to the agricultural demand, which has something to do with how much rainfall has fallen, were relatively low compared to normal. So there was less pumping overall as a ratio, which some people try to use to explain salmon survival. There's some infrastructure near Walnut Grove called the Delta Cross Channel, and this prevents water from going from the Sacramento River into the interior delta, which we know is not a good place for salmon. They do a lot better if they stay in the river. And when that's closed, the salmon don't go into the interior delta. When it's open, they do. And the gate there was either entirely or mostly closed during the out-migration season. So that would have been good for salmon. And the only thing here that really is alarming to me was this net pen acclimatization, which I alluded to. They put a lot of the fish typically into these net pens to get them used to the salt water and so that the birds don't just kill them right away, because that's what happens if they don't do that. And due to funding limitations in 2006, California couldn't afford to do this, so they just dumped all the fish into the bay. And that could explain some of it for these hatchery fish. So, looking a little bit what was going on with the weather in 2004 or 5, the water year. So this would be the brood year 2004 fish. What they experienced was California in the south. This blue is wetter, much wetter than normal, and the red is drier than normal. So there was a drought up in the Columbia River Basin. But California was near normal or wet in 2004 for the 2004 brood year. And similarly in 2005, conditions were pretty good for rainfall. And why that happened was because of some unusual conditions with the atmospheric pressure, which actually we're experiencing a bit again this year, of an almost low pressure off of our coast. Usually in the springtime, high pressure builds in. It's why we have a Mediterranean climate, this persistent high pressure offshore that drives normally wind out of the northwest that you experience if you go to the beach in the springtime or early summer. In the afternoon, it picks up. And that creates upwelling, which brings nutrients to the surfaces, what fuels the California current ecosystem and the usually rich fisheries that we have. But in these years, the pressure was much lower than normal off the coast, and then over Hudson Bay, it was higher than normal. And what this does is suppress the winds that normally come out of the northwest. And actually in the springtime, we had a lot of winds out of the southeast because the air circulates like this around the low pressure. And that brings in a lot of rain in the springtime. That's good for salmon, but it suppresses these upwelling winds, and that's bad for salmon. They're, especially for fall Chinook, they're timing their entry into the ocean to take advantage of the plankton bloom that occurs that's driven by this. So that didn't look too good. And this is some work by one of my colleagues in Oregon that he goes every 2 weeks out on a line on a research cruise, and they measure zooplankton off of Oregon and a lot of physical parameters in the ocean. And he also has a number of other things that he tracks. And so every year he can rank them according to how good they are for salmon. And a red block means it was bad, yellow is okay, and green is good. And by looking at these things, when they all line up, red and yellow, like here in 2005, this is a measure of things going badly in the ocean for salmon. So this is off Oregon, not hugely relevant necessarily to what's going on off California, but they are related. So this shows that 2004 and 2005 were pretty bad But somewhat interestingly, 1998 was at least as bad, and the fish did okay through that. This is a picture of sea surface temperatures. There are anomalies, so there are differences from the average. And yellow and red is warmer than normal, and if there were any much on there, the blue would be colder than normal. Salmon usually do better when it's colder than normal in California. And we see that in 2003 at the top, it was starting to get a little bit warm offshore. In 2004 and especially 2005 in May, the coastal waters were very warm. This is not good for salmon. It is not good for the things they eat, and it ramps up their metabolism, so they need to eat even more, but there's less for them to eat. So that's usually a bad thing. In 2006, it was still not good. So this is okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that. This is the California coast. This is San Francisco Bay, and this is Monterey Bay. So that's California, Central California. And these are sea surface temperatures. So the red and yellow are warmer than normal sea surface temperatures off the coast of California. And we see the worst here, 2005, when they're about 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal for that time of year. Still not warm enough to go swimming in Santa Cruz, unfortunately, but... And this is a picture of the upwelling, and the top two things are upwelling at 42 degrees north, which is in Oregon, and 39 north, which is just off of, a little bit north of here, off of California. And the red line is 2005, and so that would be the conditions affecting brood year 2004, and 2006 is in green. And these are accumulated upwelling. So it's the amount of water that moves offshore due to the winds. And that water brings up cold, nutrient-rich water, which fuels the ecosystem and feeds the salmon. And the black line is the average that we see. The upwelling starts usually in April, gets really going, and it runs through the summer, and then those winds break down at the end of the summer. And this accumulation of upwelling is a measure really of how much production can happen in the California current offshore here. And we see that in 2005, that red line lags the average. It got started really late, and it didn't really catch up until the end of the summer. That's not good for salmon. The green line in 2006, it started late, but then it caught up and actually passed the average. The timing of this is very important, as well as the absolute amount. And another kind of complex picture of this is this water is drugged down the coast as well as moving offshore. So what happens up in Oregon a couple weeks before, that water ends up coming to California, and so there's a kind of a conveyor that moves it down. So what happens locally as well as to the north can be important. And it looks like these 2 years that upwelling was lower than normal, and we would expect that to have a negative impact. But there's another thing on this plot I hope you can see. There are these little gray lines, which are all the other years of record. And the point to take home from that is that these weren't unprecedented. We've seen worse years than this before, and salmon didn't collapse. And that's an